What is something you wanted to quit, but are glad that you didn't? What we're going to see in just a few minutes is that God is going to put Israel through some difficult situations, not because he's abandoning them or punishing them, but because he is preparing them for what is to come. What happens in a lot of these situations with us and with Israel is that when we start something new, it's always going to be difficult because we're not going to be an expert the first time we do something. It takes time, it takes practice, and it takes dedication. And the same thing with Israel, they were not just going to walk into the promised land without any kind of problems or any kind of issues. So instead of God just allowing them to walk in unabated or without any challenges, he was going to use this as an opportunity to make them develop trust in him because he knew what they needed, even though they did not. So tonight's lesson is called When Milk Spoils. We're going to be spending time in Exodus 13 through Exodus 17. So let's start with point 1, and I am titling that Trust the Process. Has anybody heard this phrase before, trust the process? When someone says trust the process, what are they telling you to do? Usually what they're saying is, it makes sense right now, but you'll see what I'm doing later. It'll all come together in the end. Or as the great theologian Troy Bolton said, we're all in this together. So, Israel is at the point to where they've experienced 400 years of slavery, 10 plagues, the Passover, and now they're just kind of wandering around in the wilderness before they're actually going to cross over the Red Sea. And they're just waiting for the next step. But God already has a plan. Just like we've seen time and again, he was providing for them. And what we'll see is the quickest path is not always the correct path. So chapter 13, verse 17 says this. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them along the road to the land of the Philistines, even though it was nearby, for God said, the people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. Do you guys remember who the person is from the Philistines that David had to fight that scared everybody? Goliath. Now imagine their entire society being full of Goliaths. If Israel had gone straight to the promised land and they saw this land full of giants, do you think they would have just walked in and started taking over? No, they would have probably turned around and went right back to Egypt, which is exactly what God said they would do. So God knew what they were going to do. They would go over there, they would see the giants, they would see the Philistines, and they would immediately turn tail and run right back to Egypt and been willing to go back into slavery. So instead, what God does is he guides them around the Red Sea. He is telling them that the quickest path is not the correct path. We love shortcuts. We love making it the quickest distance from one point to the next. Does anybody else play the game with their GPS to where the GPS gives them the ETA they need to, where they're going to get somewhere, and you're like, my goal is to beat this time? Yeah, sometimes God says that's not the best thing for us to do, especially when it comes to spiritual growth. What he's doing with Israel is the same thing that he does with us, is that whenever we start our walk with Christ, we are freed from slavery, being sin, but it is a slow process of sanctification. It takes us literally the rest of our lives. And we're not just going to magically be exactly like Jesus the moment we say, yes, I'm going to follow Christ. It takes us the rest of our lives. There's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. We're going to have these youth camp moments to where we're on cloud 9, these mountaintop spiritual moments. And Israel is going to experience one of these in just a second. But then there's also going to be these spiritual valleys to where we feel like we're alone and we're abandoned. And Israel also experiences some of these as well. But most of the time it's because of Israel's own blindness and their fear and their negligence. But what God is doing in these moments of our lives and in Israel's life is he is teaching them that this temporary milk that they're holding on to, their dependence, their attachment to Egypt, their own way of life, he's got to break them from that. Our attachment to sin, our attachment to our old way of life, he has to break us from that so that we can truly depend on him. And so that's what he does through the entire wilderness journey. So the promised land was not the only goal. If it were, God would have wiped out the Philistines. He would have made it completely easy for them to just walk right in. We know that he can kill entire armies. He did it repeatedly in the Old Testament. The main goal for Israel and for us is that they needed to trust him completely. And we need to trust him completely as well, which required them to stop trusting Egypt and to stop trusting temporary things. The scripture continues to say that even though God took them the long way, he was with them the entire time, as a pillar of fire during the day and a pillar of smoke at night, or fire at night and smoke in the day. So while this may seem frustrating to some people, because we don't like long things, we don't like to go and have to cook a meal. We'd rather go to McDonald's or to Chick-fil-A. We would rather use a microwave than have to wait 45 minutes for a Hot Pocket to cook in the oven. Our spiritual life is not a microwavable thing. It takes time. It takes development. And we learn that through the journey of Israel in the wilderness. He wanted his people to succeed and knew they needed more time to get there. And it took them 40 years, and they still didn't have everything figured out. And we want to try to have things figured out in the evening. Thinking about it in your own life. What if the missed opportunities that you got angry and upset about were actually God showing mercy from a position that you were not ready for? Let's say you were really hoping that you would make a sports team, but you didn't make it. And that was God preventing you from being injured, breaking a leg, or something that you would not necessarily be able to recover from. Or there was a group of people that you really, really wanted to fit in with, but you just couldn't break into that friend group. But that was God preventing you from hanging around people that would draw you away from him. Or even as adults, what if there's a job that you really wanted or a promotion that you really wanted that God knew that you were not prepared for because it may make you sacrifice something that's worth more than money or power? God kept them away from the promised land for 40 years because they were not ready yet. God keeps us away from certain opportunities and certain things because we are not ready to handle them or because he's preventing us from hurting ourselves or being destroyed. And instead of us looking at it as a missed opportunity, maybe we need to look at it as God showing us mercy. And we may never know, only God is going to know. But Israel always saw things from a negative perspective. Are we guilty of doing that too? I can be. I complain a lot. How many times has God kept me from taking a job somewhere or meeting someone knowing that that was not going to be a good fit? How many times has God kept you from doing something because he knew that that was not going to be good for you? We don't know. But part of trusting God is understanding that not only does he allow us to do things, he also prevents us from things too. And only he knows. And so the quickest path is not always the correct path. The path that we want is not always the correct path. That's why Scripture tells us that we need to trust his guidance and trust his leading. The right path may seem impossible, but we know that God is faithful. After they get to the Red Sea, God tells Moses that Pharaoh's coming. So he already tells look, Pharaoh's coming. Here's what's going to happen. You don't need to be worried about it. But the people of Israel are always freaking out. They're always terrified everything that's going to happen because they don't trust God. Even though they've seen him do all these miraculous things, they still don't trust him. Pharaoh moves his army closer and closer and closer. In verses 11 and 12, it says, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt?" This is the people of Israel complaining. "Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." They go from begging God to save them from slavery now to just saying, "You should have just left us in Egypt so that we could die." Because they see Egypt coming closer. Their backs are against the wall. They have the Egyptian army on one side. They've got the Red Sea on the other, and they think that there's absolutely no way out. So their first thought is not, hey, there's this God that's got this pillar of smoke right here that has done everything for us so far. That had 10 plagues that he did to essentially torture Egypt. Maybe we should have faith in him. No. We're going to immediately look at this problem that is right in front of us, and we're going to surrender to Egypt so that we can go back into slavery and do what we were doing, so that we don't die in the desert. They were so ready to give up that they wanted to turn around and go right back to what they were doing because they thought that following God was going to be impossible. They didn't have enough faith to trust in the God that had been providing for them, that they just wanted to go back to doing what they were doing because it was easier to surrender to Pharaoh. It was their own unbelief. Even though they had seen God do so many things, they still were controlled by their fear and by their desire to just go back to the way things were. They did not have enough faith to take that step forward and say, "God, we're going to trust you no matter what." Moses tells them to calm down and to trust God. And God is faithful. from what looks like an impossible situation, God once again provided for them. The scripture says that the same pillar of smoke, this is something I had never noticed before. It said that the same pillar of smoke that had been guiding them around the wilderness actually separated them from Pharaoh's army. So it created some kind of supernatural barrier that the army of Pharaoh could not get to them all night. So God had created this barrier between Pharaoh's army and the Israelites. And then God brought in this strong wind to separate the Red Sea so that they could walk across on dry land with these massive walls of water on either side. And they start going across. And Scripture says it takes them most of the night to cross. And then as soon as they get mostly across, then Egypt starts following through them, which is not a mistake. God had a plan. So he lets Egypt come through. They start chasing after them on their chariots. As soon as the last Israelites hits dry ground, the waters crash down and completely wipes out the army of Egypt. And the Israelites see Pharaoh's army drown. And again, it points to God's faithfulness. And the Israelites worship God, and they're praising him for what he did. So it says, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. This was a major breaking point for the Israelites. By them crossing the Red Sea, God was telling them, you no longer can go back to Egypt. You've crossed over. There's no way you can go back. Your former way of life is dead. Does he not tell us the same thing with salvation? Who you were before is now dead. I have made you alive in me. So it's done the same thing with the Israelites. So in these two major moments, God took difficult moments and showed his people that he is faithful. But what we see is this was not enough for them. This was the point where they could not go back to Egypt. God removed what had been holding them back, their former life. While they may have physically escaped Egypt, Egypt still had a hold on their hearts. And it would take much more time for them to be fully freed. So the second thing is trust takes time. So this will be Exodus 15:22 through 17:7. Again, we're not going to read through all of it. Just going to hit the high points. So what we see in these next two chapters is that Israel raises several complaints to Moses. Israel loves to complain. And because their trust is not in God, they are swept away by fear, rather remembering that God has provided for them every step of the way. They were constantly asking the question, can this God really provide what I need? Can God really provide what I need? So let me ask you a question. What is your favorite memory from when you were a small child? Well, it's interesting that memories have such a powerful hold on us. They influence decisions we make and can completely change our moods and experiences. And nostalgia is one of those things that we remember things fondly even when there could have been negative circumstances revolving around them. And this is kind of what Israel is trapped in. So for instance, I remember maybe like 15 years ago, I got food poisoning. And it took me 5 years, like a restaurant that we had eaten at numerous times, and it took me at least 5 years before I ate there again. It was Little Caesars, and we lived in Lancaster. It was Little Caesars. But I got food poisoning. I never had food poisoning in my life. And it took me at least 5 years before I would eat there again. It's Little Caesars, I mean, come on. But there are also times where we remember things differently and we only remember the positive things, but we forget the negative things. And this is where Israel is right now. They're sitting in the wilderness, they're hungry, they're angry at Moses, and they start complaining because they only remember the good things about Egypt. They had food. They start romanticizing the past. Even though God had repeatedly proven himself that he could provide, that he would protect them, that he would keep them safe, they wanted to go back to their old way of life. Now they couldn't. But all they remembered was, hey, we had food, but in reality they'd forgotten the fact that they were slaves, that they had been begging God to save them, to deliver them, and now they've been delivered. They just want to go back to their old life. They romanticized the past. They had a youth camp experience. They went from a spiritual mountain to business as usual. They crossed the Red Sea. They were joyous. They were celebrating. Chapter 15 is literally a song about them celebrating the fact that God delivered them from the Egyptians. And then 15:22, 3 days later, they're complaining again. They go from this miraculous thing where they're delivered from the Egyptians to 3 days later, they're already complaining. Business as usual. So they go from this miraculous moment to complaints. A test of faith is what we see. So God says, okay, I'm going to help you again, but we're going to have a test of faith. So in these 2.5 chapters, we see a repeated theme. The people complain because they lack faith. They remember Egypt being better than it actually was, but they can't go back. Moses goes to God, God provides what they need, and then it repeats. In each instance, though, it is a greater test of faith. With the first instance, we say they don't have water. So in verses 22 through 26 in chapter 15, they don't have water. It says, and Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea. They went out to the wilderness of Shur. They journeyed for 3 days in the wilderness without finding water. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. That is why they named it Marah. The people grumbled to Moses, what are we going to drink? So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he threw it into the water became drinkable. The Lord made a statute, an ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. He said, if you will carefully obey the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, pay attention to his commands, and keep all of his statutes, I will not inflict any illnesses on you that I inflicted on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. So he tells them, look, if you'll be obedient, I won't curse you like I did the Egyptians. So this was a test of faith for them, that even if they could not see God in the moment, that they could trust that he was still going to provide for them. But they were still complaining. So he points Moses to this tree, and here's the interesting thing. We don't know of any tree that could actually make water not bitter. So this is potentially a supernatural tree that God created just for this moment, because archaeologists and historians believe that they found the location and the water is again bitter. So he provided for them in this moment while they were there to make the water drinkable. But now the water is bitter again, like today, and it's undrinkable. So he provided for them in that moment so that they could drink it. And after this incident, God tells them he's going to test his people. He's answered their prayer, he's freed them from slavery, he's given them water, and now he wants to see them grow in their trust. If they're obedient, he's going to provide for them. And then it says right after this, he sends them to another location that has 12 springs for them to drink from, and there's 70 date trees, like little fruits that they can eat. But that was not enough for them. They still did not trust God. They start complaining again because now they don't have any food. So chapter 16, verses 2 through 5, and then 15 through 21. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into the wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for the day. This way I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days. And then 15 through 21. When the Israelites saw it, talking about the bread, they asked one another, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. I love how just matter-of-fact Scripture can be sometimes. Moses told them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as you can eat, as you need to eat. You may take 2 quarts per individual, according to the number of people each of you has in his tent. So the Israelites did this. Some gathered a lot, some a little. When they measured it by quarts, the person who gathered a lot had no surplus. The person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as they needed to eat. Moses said to them, no one is to let any of it remain until morning. But they didn't listen to Moses. Some people left part of it until morning, and it bred worms, and it stank. Therefore Moses was angry with them. They gathered it every morning, each gathering as much as he needed to eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. So God provided water. They started complaining. Again, they just wished that God would kill them or allow them to have died in Egypt. They did not trust that God would provide for them. So in response, God provides for them again, but he tests them again. He tells Moses he's going to rain down bread for 6 days, but they can't keep it overnight or it's going to spoil. They also had to get up each morning and gather it, otherwise it's going to melt. So not only is he going to provide, this time they actually have to take a step of faith and go out and get it. So first time he gives them water, this time he's telling them, not only am I going to provide food for you, you've got to get up and actually go get it before the sun comes out or you're not going to eat that day. So there's another step that he gives them. Many tried to gather more than they needed. They tried to hoard it, but as God said, It's going to spoil, it's going to be full of worms, and it's going to smell terrible. God intentionally allowed the manna to spoil because he was teaching them a lesson. They wanted enough bread for tomorrow because they did not trust that God could provide for today. The spoiled manna revealed their lack of trust. The manna spoiled because God loved them too much to let them place their trust in stored bread instead of his daily allowance. They saw that God provided a miracle in the bread, but still they did not trust that he would provide enough for each day. Then another one, no work. 16:22-30. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much food, 4 quarts apiece, and all the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He told them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and set aside everything left over to be kept until morning." So they set it aside until morning as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink or have maggots in it. Wonderful. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you won't find any in the field. For 6 days you will gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. Yet on the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they did not find any, because they did not trust God. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and instructions? Understand that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he will give you 2 days' worth of bread. Each of you stay where you are. No one is to leave his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. So he tells them, on the 6th day, I'm going to give you 2 days' worth of food, and it's not going to spoil. People still did not believe him. But here's what's interesting. They had spent 400 years as a society in slavery. More than likely, they had never had a day off in their life. They had worked 7 days straight. So their mentality, because they were still stuck in this tradition of slavery, is that they worked every day. So now that God has given them the chore or given them the responsibility to actually get up and do something, they were falling back into the trap of doing what they've always known to do, which is get up and go. And now that he's told them, hey, you're going to sit in your tent and do nothing and just rest for an entire day, it was completely foreign to them. And so because they still had not developed enough trust for God, they were going to get up and they were going to go and look for that bread again. And so God was not only teaching them to trust him, he was also breaking the tradition that they had been ingrained within them for over 400 years. So again, it takes time for them to trust. They were not ready yet to just fully listen to God because they had been forced to be slaves for 400 years. It took them time to actually rest. Egypt had taught them their value came from their productivity, what they could get done each day. They were forced to get up and work, but God was telling them now, you can rest. But not just rest, but you can rest in me. God was teaching them that their value came from belonging to him. They were no longer slaves. They were no longer required to perform. God was giving them a day just to rest in his presence. And then the fourth one was no self-sufficiency. So chapter 17, verses 1-7. The Israelite community left the wilderness of sin, moving from one place to the next. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So the people complained to Moses, "Give us water to drink." God tells Moses to take some of the elders with him to the rock at Mount Horeb, and he says, I will present myself on top of the rock, and then take the same staff that you separated the Nile with, strike the rock, and I will bring water forth, and they can drink from it. So this is the final test that we see in these chapters tonight. And it revolves again around water, but this time it goes from the Israelites complaining that they should have been left to die in Egypt to now it has escalated to Moses being afraid that they're going to try to kill him. God responds to take the elders so that they can now see that God is working through Moses and for his people. What was God testing here? The question the people were asking through all of this since they left Egypt is the question, can God be trusted? That's a question that we ask on a daily basis. Every decision that we make, we are asking the question, can God be trusted? Can God really take care of us? Whenever we have an issue of integrity, whenever we have an issue of honesty, am I going to tell the truth or am I going to lie to my parents? Because if I lie, I'm not going to get in trouble, but if I tell the truth, I am. Can God provide? Can God really take care of me? This is the same question that was asked in Genesis chapter 3. Did God really say? Exodus 17, when the Pharisees demanded a sign from Jesus. It's the same thing we ask today. Can God really provide? Is God really who he says he is? Can God be trusted? Can he really take care of us? God was teaching them that he could supply their needs each day, that they did not need to hoard, they did not need to fear. God could provide enough. Whether it was water, whether it was food or sufficiency, God is enough. He was showing them that they could trust him and they could let go of Egypt. They could let go of their former life. They could let go of the sin that they were holding on to, the slavery that they were holding on to. Even though they had been conditioned to depend on Egypt for the last 400 years, now they could fully trust God, and he was repeatedly proving himself to them as he guided them through the wilderness. Each test went deeper than the one before it. God wasn't just testing whether Israel believed he could provide water, food, or anything else. He was testing whether they would trust him enough and stop depending on Egypt, themselves and their own understanding. Every test was teaching Israel the same lesson. God was enough. Every test is teaching us that same lesson. God is enough. Yet Israel kept looking for security somewhere else. The wilderness wasn't just exposing their hunger for bread, it was exposing their hunger for something only God could satisfy. So that brings us to the last point. That just like them, we need to trust the provider, not the provision. So that takes us to John chapter 6. Every one of us is faced with the same challenge. Before we know Christ, we are all searching for something to bring us fulfillment that will fulfill this hunger, this emptiness that we feel inside. We all have a desire for this milk, this provision of temporary things that we need each day, but it's never going to be enough. As we have seen with Israel, it is only God who can provide those things, and it is only Christ who takes what we truly need and can give it to us. It isn't food or water or even rest. It is a relationship with Christ himself. So the first thing we need to understand as believers today is that the manna was never meant to be enough. The manna was never meant to be enough. Let's look at John chapter 6, verses 31 and 32. This is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. The Pharisees are telling him, our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. Just as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus responds, truly I tell you, Moses didn't give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. The Pharisees are questioning Jesus and refer back to how God provided manna for their ancestors. The Israelites, the Pharisees, and many of us get blinded by the provisions that we forget about the one who provides it. Just as the Israelites were only focused on manna and water, sometimes we only get focused on the problems too. That's why even though the Israelites complained 4 times between chapters 13 and 17, God reminded them 12 times of his faithfulness. They complained 4 times, but God told them 12 times that he is going to provide for them. We need to remind ourselves many more times that God is going to provide more than we complain. The second thing is that Jesus is the true bread of life. Let's look at 33 through 35. For the bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said, Sir, give us the bread always. Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. No one comes to me will ever be hungry, and no one who believes in me will ever be thirsty again. So Jesus tells the people that the manna was only meant to be temporary, but if they want the true bread that gives life, they need him. He then says that no one who comes to me will ever be hungry or thirsty again. So he states the 2 main complaints that the Israelites have in the wilderness. This is not a mistake. He is saying that I can fulfill not only your temporary needs, but I will fulfill your eternal needs as well. You can trust me to provide for you because I am faithful. And then the third thing, temporary things always spoil. Verse 36, but as I told you, you've seen me, and yet you do not believe. Jesus gives the Pharisees the same test that God gave the Israelites and that he gives us today. He says, you've seen me, yet you do not believe. Every temporary thing eventually spoils. That milk is about 2 weeks past date. By the time we get done with this series, it's probably going to be green. It spoils. Everything that we have ever bought is going to break. Everything that we know is going to pass away. Everything that has been created is temporary. Only God is eternal. Success spoils. Every achievement that we have is eventually going to expire. Popularity spoils. You may be the most popular kid in your school right now, but when you graduate high school, none of that's going to matter. Money spoils. The economy's kind of crashing right now. The dollar's not as much as it used to be. Comfort spoils. Comfort can go away really quickly. Relationships fail. Health fades. Bread molds. Only Christ remains. God was not teaching Israel how to survive the wilderness. He was teaching Israel how to trust him in the wilderness. God has never promised that he's going to make our lives easy, but he has told us and is teaching us how to trust him in the difficult moments. This is how trust works. What God was doing with Israel was putting them through various tests to develop faith so that when things got harder, they would trust him rather than running back to sin or trying to run back to Egypt. It was a long process. But a lot of times we have the habit of thinking, wow, God was literally with them. How could they possibly keep making that same mistake? But we do the same thing. If we are believers, we have the Holy Spirit living inside of us, and yet we still struggle with sin. We still struggle with making the same mistakes. We still struggle with complaining, even though we know that God is providing. Sanctification is not an easy walk. Sometimes it feels like Jesus dragging us more than it does us walking beside him. But there is no quick fix for trusting God, because it means breaking our old habits and believing that God is trustworthy, that he knows what's best for us, and that he can provide for us even when we can't see it in the moment. So as we wrap up tonight, I want to leave you with this question. Are you trying to build a life that does not require God to provide for you tomorrow?